An orphan is adopted by a billionaire woman, but is despised by his new grandparents until he sits at the piano and the orphan had never known a place he could call home. From as far back as he could remember, his life had been a revolving door of orphanages, each one offering only temporary shelter. The faces changed, the rules varied, but the loneliness was always the same. He had learned to keep his hopes low, never expecting a warm embrace or a place where he truly belonged. Until one day, a wealthy woman entered his life, adopting him and whisking him away into a world he had only glimpsed from the outside. For the first time, there was a spark of hope that his life might finally take a turn for the better. The woman's mansion was nothing short of magnificent, a place of grandeur and opulence that took the orphan's breath away. From the vast, gleaming floors to the towering walls adorned with art, everything felt like a dream. The woman was kind, her smile warm and her gestures gentle, making the boy feel, at least in those first moments, that maybe this place could be home. But that feeling of hope quickly collided with the cold reality that her parents, his new grandparents, did not share her warmth. The old couple's gaze upon him was sharp, filled with silent judgment from the moment he entered their lives. It didn't take long for the boy to understand that no matter how kind his new mother was, the grandparents would never truly accept him. Their disapproval was subtle but constant, like a cold wind that never ceased. He was different, they believed, unworthy of being part of their prestigious family. They didn't hide their disdain, reminding him through their every word and glance that he came from a humble background, far beneath their status. To them, he was an outsider, an unwelcome addition to their perfect world. And so, despite the luxury that surrounded him, the boy felt smaller with each passing day. The rejection hurt more than he expected. In the orphanages, rejection had been part of the everyday fabric of life, something he had grown used to. But here, in this grand home filled with promise, the cold shoulders and disapproving stares cut deeper. The grandparents didn't need to speak their rejection aloud. It was evident in every action, every glance, every dismissive tone they directed his way. They barely acknowledged his existence, and when they did, it was to remind him of how little he mattered. Each interaction with them was a painful reminder that he didn't belong. Despite his efforts to fit in, to earn even a shred of their approval, the boy found himself constantly falling short. He tried to be polite, to stay out of the way, to meet their every expectation, but nothing worked. The grandparents' icy demeanor remained unchanged, and their disapproval seemed to grow with each passing day. The boy, once hopeful, now felt the weight of their disdain pressing down on him, making it harder to breathe, harder to hope. He began to withdraw, seeking solace in the quiet corners of the mansion where he could escape their judgmental eyes. Nights in the mansion were the hardest. In the silence of his luxurious new room, the boy would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the coldness of the house seep into his bones. The vastness of the space only amplified his loneliness. He had never known such luxury, yet it felt like a gilded cage. No matter how soft the bed or how fine the clothes, he couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't belong there. And no amount of kindness from his new mother could fill the void left by the rejection he faced daily. He felt like an intruder in a world that wasn't his. The grandmother, in particular, seemed to harbor the most contempt for the boy. Her gaze was always distant, her words sharp and dismissive. She barely spoke to him unless it was to criticize or remind him of his place. The grandfather, while less vocal, was no less cold. His silence spoke volumes, and the few words he did offer were laced with disapproval. The boy could feel the tension whenever they were in the same room, a constant reminder that he was not welcome. Each encounter with him chipped away at his confidence, leaving him feeling smaller and more isolated. Despite everything, the boy clung to the hope that things might change. He believed that if he could just prove himself, if he could find a way to show his worth, the grandparents might soften toward him. But each attempt he made seemed to push them further away. His every gesture of kindness, every effort to please them, was met with indifference or, worse, thinly veiled contempt. It was as if they were waiting for him to fail, to confirm their belief that he would never be good enough. And so, The boy's heart grew heavy with the weight of their expectations. The mansion, which had once seemed like a dream, now felt more like a prison. The boy was trapped in a life that promised so much yet delivered so little. He had everything he could ever want materially, but emotionally, he was starving. His new mother tried her best to make him feel at home, but even her love couldn't erase the sting of the grandparents' rejection. It was a constant battle within him, between gratitude for the life he had been given and the deep-seated loneliness that gnawed at him every day. He began to wonder if he would ever truly belong. Still, the boy wasn't ready to give up. He had been through worse before, and he knew how to survive rejection. But as the days turned into weeks, the weight of the grandparents' disdain became harder to bear. He could feel their disapproval in every corner of the house, in every room he entered. Yet, somewhere deep inside, a small flicker of hope remained. He didn't know how, but he felt that something would change. It had to. He just needed to find his place in this strange new world. A place where he could be seen for who he truly was, not just where he came from. And then, one day, as he wandered the halls of the mansion in silence, he stumbled upon something unexpected. An old, dusty piano, tucked away in a room that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Something about the instrument drew him in, an unexplainable pull that he couldn't ignore. Little did he know, that piano would become his sanctuary, and the key to unlocking a future he never imagined possible. Despite the boy's best efforts, the chasm between him and his new grandparents widened with each passing day. He sought their approval in small, almost invisible ways, offering a polite smile, staying out of their way, trying to be as unnoticeable as possible. But no matter how hard he tried, their rejection loomed like a dark cloud over him. They saw him not as a member of their family, but as an outsider, a stain on the pristine image they cherished. The boy could feel their disdain in every sideways glance, every curt word that passed their lips. It was a silent, suffocating rejection, one that dug deeper than any spoken insult. The grandparents were relentless in their subtle cruelty. Though they never raised their voices or lashed out directly, their coldness spoke volumes. Every movement the boy made seemed to trigger their disapproval. His mere presence was enough to draw sharp looks and sighs of frustration. He could feel the weight of their judgment in everything he did, from how he ate to how he walked through the grand halls of the mansion. Their standards were impossibly high, and to them, he would never measure up. They didn't see him as their grandson. They saw him as a reminder of everything they feared: imperfection, difference, and a world beyond their control. His new mother, the kind billionaire, tried her best to shield him from the grandparents' icy treatment, but there was little she could do. She was caught between her love for her parents and her deep care for the boy she had adopted. She showered him with affection, gave him everything he could ever want materially, but even she couldn't erase the pain of being unwanted. The boy appreciated her efforts, but the tension in the household was impossible to ignore. It lingered in every room, in every strained conversation between the mother and her parents, and the boy felt the sting of it all the more. The boy's attempts to win over his grandparents only seemed to make things worse. He would clean up after himself meticulously, trying to show them that he was not a burden. He avoided causing any disruptions, speaking only when spoken to, and never making demands. But every act of humility was met with more disdain. To the grandparents, his efforts only highlighted how different he was from them, how far he fell short of their expectations. In their eyes, he would always be the orphan, the boy from nowhere, who could never truly belong in their world of wealth and privilege. The grandmother, especially, seemed to harbor a deep-seated resentment toward the boy. Her coldness was sharper than the grandfather's, more cutting in its precision. She would criticize the smallest of things: how he held his fork, how he pronounced certain words, even how he looked at her. Each comment was like a small, calculated wound, designed to remind him of his place. The boy would nod quietly, accepting her words without protest, but inside, the hurt grew. It was clear to him that no matter what he did, she would never see him as anything other than an intruder in her carefully curated life. The grandfather's rejection was quieter, but no less painful. He would sit in silence, watching the boy with an expression that seemed to be a mix of disappointment and disdain. There were no harsh words, no outright accusations, but the boy could feel his disapproval in the air. The grandfather didn't need to say much for the boy to understand that he was unwelcome. The old man's silence was a wall, impenetrable and cold, and no matter how hard the boy tried, he couldn't break through it. He felt like a ghost in his own home, existing in the periphery, never fully seen or acknowledged. The boy's isolation grew, and with it, his sense of inadequacy. He began to question whether he deserved the life he had been given. Maybe the grandparents were right. Maybe he didn't belong in this world of wealth and privilege. The constant rejection made him doubt himself, made him wonder if he was destined to be an outsider forever. He longed for a place where he could be accepted, where he wouldn't have to prove his worth every second of the day. But as long as the grandparents continued to view him as less than, that place seemed further and further away. As the tension in the house mounted, the boy's new mother began to notice the toll it was taking on him. She could see the way his shoulders slumped when he entered a room where her parents were present, the way his voice grew quieter, more hesitant. She tried to intervene, speaking to her parents in private, asking them to be kinder, more understanding. But her pleas fell on deaf ears. The grandparents were set in their ways, convinced that the boy would never be part of their family. To them, he was a burden, a mistake they had to tolerate and nothing more. The boy found himself spending more and more time alone, retreating into the quiet corners of the mansion where he could escape the constant judgment. The grand halls that had once seemed so full of promise now felt oppressive, each room a reminder of the family he would never fully be part of. He wandered aimlessly through the mansion, feeling more like a visitor than a son. But even in his solitude, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change, that this life of rejection and isolation wasn't the end of his story. And then, one day, as he wandered the vast estate, trying to find a place where he could breathe freely, he stumbled upon an old, forgotten room. Inside, covered in dust and shadow, was a piano, a grand, beautiful instrument that looked as though it hadn't been touched in years. The boy felt a strange pull toward it, an inexplicable connection that he couldn't understand. Without thinking, he sat down at the piano, his fingers hovering over the keys. Little did he know that piano would soon become his escape, his salvation, and the key to unlocking a new chapter of his life. The room was dimly lit, its windows covered in thick layers of dust, as though time itself had forgotten it existed. The boy, drawn by some invisible force, stepped carefully inside. The air was heavy, musty, and still, but his eyes were immediately drawn to the piano that stood in the center. Its once polished wood now dull and worn. He approached it cautiously, unsure of why he felt such a pull toward the instrument. It was as if the piano had been waiting for him, sitting silently through the years, untouched and unnoticed. His heart pounded as he reached out a trembling hand, gently pressing a key. The sound that echoed from the piano was soft, hesitant, yet something about it resonated deep within him. The boy had never touched a piano before, had never been taught how to play, yet the moment his fingers rested on the keys, it felt natural, almost familiar. He pressed another key, then another, and before he knew it, his hands were moving across the instrument with a grace that surprised even him. The melodies he played were simple, almost instinctual, yet they carried an emotion so raw and pure that it filled the room like a long-forgotten memory. For the first time in what felt like forever, the boy felt a sense of peace. Sitting at that piano, he could forget about the judgmental gazes of the grandparents, the weight of their disapproval. Here, in this hidden room, it didn't matter who he was or where he came from. The music flowed from his fingers effortlessly, as if the piano itself were guiding him, revealing a part of himself he never knew existed. Every note felt like a conversation, a dialogue between the boy and the instrument, and in those moments, he wasn't the orphan or the outsider. He was simply a musician. The boy spent hours at the piano, losing track of time as he let the music carry him away. It became his refuge, a place where the world outside couldn't reach him. Whenever the weight of the grandparents' rejection became too much to bear, he would return to the piano, finding solace in its keys. The melodies he played were simple at first, but as the days went by, they grew more complex, more intricate. He didn't know where the music came from or how he knew what to play, but it didn't matter. All that mattered was the peace he found in those stolen moments of harmony. What the boy didn't know was that one of the grandparents had heard him. One afternoon, as the boy played, lost in his music, the grandfather passed by the room, drawn by the faint sound of the piano. He paused at the door, listening, his brow furrowing in confusion. The boy's music was hauntingly beautiful, filled with a depth of emotion that took the old man by surprise. He had expected nothing from the orphan, had assumed the boy was talentless, just as he had always believed him to be. Yet here he was, creating something that stirred something deep within the grandfather, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. The grandfather stood in silence, hidden in the shadows, as the boy continued to play. Each note seemed to echo through the old man's mind, unraveling memories he had long buried. He had known music like this before, but not for a very long time. The boy's playing reminded him of someone from his past, but he couldn't place the memory. Conflicted, the grandfather didn't reveal himself. He simply listened, letting the music wash over him, unsure of what to make of the emotions it stirred within him. For the first time since the boy had arrived, the old man felt something other than disdain. As the boy played, unaware of his silent audience, the music became more intense, more filled with emotion. He poured all of his loneliness, all of his rejection, into the notes, and the piano responded as if it understood. The room seemed to fade away, leaving only the boy and the music. It was a form of expression he had never known before, a language that needed no words. And for the first time since he had entered the mansion, he felt free from the weight of expectations, free from the fear of not being enough. In this room, at this piano, he could simply be. When the boy finally stopped playing, he sat in silence for a moment, his hands still resting on the keys. He hadn't noticed how long he had been playing or how deeply he had lost himself in the music. But as the last note faded, reality slowly crept back in. He stood up, feeling lighter somehow, as though the music had lifted some of the burden from his shoulders. But as he turned to leave the room, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The piano had given him something he couldn't yet name, but it was there, just beneath the surface. The boy returned to the piano the next day and the day after that. It became his secret place, a world where he could escape the harshness of his new life. But each time he played, the music seemed to grow richer, more vibrant, as if the piano itself were unlocking parts of him he had never known existed. He didn't know that the grandfather had continued to listen, hiding in the shadows, drawn back to the room by the boy's music. And though the old man would never admit it, each time he listened, his heart softened just a little more. Unbeknownst to the boy, the piano had begun to change the dynamics in the mansion. The music, so full of emotion, had started to work its way into the cracks of the family's cold exterior. The grandfather, once so firm in his rejection of the boy, now found himself questioning his own feelings. The melodies haunted him, reminding him of things he had long tried to forget. And though the boy remained unaware, the music was doing more than just giving him solace. It was slowly transforming the household, note by note. Day after day, the boy returned to the piano, finding comfort in the melodies that seemed to flow effortlessly from his fingers. It became his escape, his sanctuary from the world that judged him so harshly. But as he played, he remained unaware that his secret was no longer his alone. The grandfather had discovered his hidden talent, though the boy didn't know it yet. The old man's footsteps were silent as he approached the door, careful not to disturb the boy. From the shadows, the grandfather stood, his emotions in turmoil as he listened to the music filling the room. The grandfather had never expected to feel this way about the boy. For months, he had seen the child as nothing more than an intruder, a reminder of everything his family wasn't supposed to be. But now, as he stood there, hidden from view, something inside him began to shift. The music touched him in a way he hadn't anticipated. It stirred memories from long ago, memories he had buried deep beneath years of pride and bitterness. Each note the boy played seemed to unravel those layers, reaching into the heart of the old man who had long since forgotten what it felt like to be moved. As the boy played, oblivious to the grandfather's presence, the room seemed to fill with something more than just music. There was an intensity in the air, a connection forming between the boy and the piano, and, though unseen, between the boy and the grandfather. The old man's hands clenched at his sides as he fought against the emotions rising within him. He didn't want to feel this way. He didn't want to be moved by the orphan's talent, didn't want to admit that the boy might be more than he had first assumed. But the music was undeniable, and with each passing day, it became harder to maintain his cold indifference. The boy, lost in the music, began to pour more of himself into each performance. He played as though the piano understood him, as though it were the only thing in the world that truly knew how he felt. All the rejection, all the loneliness he had experienced, came out through the melodies he created. And as he played, the boy began to feel a sense of freedom, a release from the weight of his new life. He had no idea that the grandfather, the man who had judged him so harshly, was standing just outside, listening with a heart that was slowly softening with every note. It was the first time in years that the grandfather had allowed himself to feel vulnerable. The boy's music reminded him of someone he had lost long ago, someone who had once brought music into his life with the same passion and emotion. It was a memory he had tried to bury, a pain he had locked away deep inside. But now, as he listened to the boy play, that old wound began to reopen. The music, so pure and heartfelt, was breaking down the walls he had built around his heart. And though he still resisted, a part of him couldn't help but wonder if he had been wrong about the boy all along. The grandfather's conflict grew with each passing day. He wanted to hold on to his beliefs, to cling to the idea that the boy didn't belong. But the music was changing him, even if he refused to admit it. Each time he listened, the memories of the past became clearer, more painful. He found himself torn between the pride that had always defined him and the emotion that was slowly creeping back into his life. It was a battle he hadn't expected, and one he wasn't sure he was ready to face. But the boy, with his unknowing gift, was forcing him to confront the feelings he had long kept hidden. The boy, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware of the effect his music was having. To him, the piano was simply a refuge, a place where he could be free from judgment and rejection. He never imagined that anyone else was listening, much less that his music was reaching the very person who had rejected him the most. The boy played for himself, for the peace it brought him. But in doing so, he was unknowingly reaching the heart of the grandfather, breaking through the old man's defenses in a way no words ever could. One day, after a particularly emotional session at the piano, the boy sat quietly for a moment, his hands resting on the keys. He hadn't noticed the shadow outside the door, hadn't felt the presence of the grandfather standing just out of sight. But as he prepared to leave the room, something made him pause. For the first time, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, someone else had been listening. It was a fleeting thought, one he quickly dismissed. After all, why would anyone care about his music? Still, the feeling lingered as he stepped out of the room, unaware of the grandfather slipping away into the shadows. The next day, the grandfather found himself drawn back to the room, unable to resist the pull of the boy's music. He told himself it was curiosity, nothing more. But as he stood in the doorway, listening to the boy play, he knew it was something deeper. The boy's music was changing him, stirring emotions he had thought long dead. And though he still struggled to accept it, a part of him couldn't deny the truth. The boy was more than he had ever given him credit for. The music had revealed something undeniable, something that was slowly breaking through the old man's hardened heart. As the grandfather walked away from the room that day, he couldn't help but feel conflicted. The boy's music had touched something deep within him, but it also reminded him of the pain he had tried to forget. The emotions were too raw, too intense, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to face them. But even as he tried to push them away, the melodies lingered in his mind, haunting him long after he had left the room. The boy had unknowingly awakened something in the old man, something that would soon force him to confront the past he had spent so long avoiding. The turning point came during a family gathering that neither the boy nor the grandparents could have anticipated. It was an evening filled with relatives, distant friends, and socialites, all gathered in the grand hall of the mansion for a formal dinner. The boy, as usual, kept to the background, avoiding the spotlight and staying quiet in the shadows. He was accustomed to being invisible, especially in gatherings like these, where he was just another reminder of the family's unexpected adoption. But fate had other plans. The piano, sitting silently in the corner of the room, called to him, as it always did. Without thinking, the boy slipped away from the crowd and took his place at the piano. He didn't mean to draw attention. He only wanted to escape for a moment, to find solace in the one thing that brought him peace. His fingers hovered over the keys, and before he knew it, the music began to flow. At first, the notes were soft, barely noticeable over the hum of conversation in the room. But as the boy lost himself in the music, the melodies grew louder, richer, and more full of emotion. The guests began to fall silent, one by one, as the music filled the air, commanding their attention. The boy played as if no one were watching, his eyes closed, his heart fully invested in the music. It was a piece he had created in those private moments, a reflection of all the loneliness, rejection, and yearning he had felt since arriving at the mansion. But in that moment, it wasn't sadness that the music conveyed. It was something deeper, something that touched everyone who heard it. The guests, who had barely noticed the boy before, were now captivated, unable to tear their eyes away from the child at the piano. His fingers moved effortlessly, as though they were guided by something beyond him, something pure and powerful. The grandparents were among those who stood in stunned silence, their expressions unreadable as they watched the boy transform before their eyes. For so long, they had seen him as an outsider, a child who didn't belong in their world. But as the music washed over them, they couldn't deny the talent that was unfolding in front of them. The grandfather, in particular, felt the familiar tug of emotion, the same one that had haunted him in the shadows of the hidden room. Only this time, it was out in the open, undeniable and clear for all to see. The boy was no longer invisible. As the boy continued to play, the atmosphere in the room shifted. What had started as a simple dinner had now become something much more profound. The music seemed to awaken something in everyone present, a shared sense of awe and emotion that connected them in ways words never could. The boy's music was more than just a performance. It was a revelation. The grandparents, who had always dismissed him, now found themselves grappling with a new reality. Could it be that this boy, this orphan they had rejected so thoroughly, had something special to offer their family? The question hung in the air, unspoken but heavy. When the boy finally stopped playing, the room remained still, as if the guests were afraid to break the spell that had been cast. He opened his eyes, surprised to find so many eyes on him. For a moment, he felt a wave of fear, certain that he had overstepped, that he would be scolded for drawing attention to himself. But the silence was not one of judgment. It was one of awe. Slowly, the guests began to applaud, a quiet ripple at first, but then louder, more enthusiastic. The boy's heart raced as he realized that they weren't mocking him. They were moved by him. The grandparents exchanged glances, both of them too proud to admit what they were feeling. But the truth was impossible to ignore. The boy, the one they had deemed unworthy, had just captivated an entire room of people with a talent that none of them had expected. The grandfather's chest tightened with a mix of emotions he couldn't quite name. He had known the boy could play, had listened in secret to his hidden performances, but seeing it here, in front of everyone, made it real in a way he hadn't anticipated. The boy had something they could no longer overlook. The grandmother, who had been the most vocal about her disdain for the boy, found herself struggling to reconcile what she had just witnessed. She had spent so long dismissing him, certain that he could never rise to the standards of their family. Yet here he was, proving her wrong with every note he played. Her pride, so carefully built over the years, now felt fragile in the face of the boy's undeniable talent. She looked at him with new eyes, not quite ready to admit her mistake, but unable to ignore the truth any longer. The boy was no longer just an outsider. He was something more. As the applause died down, the boy stood awkwardly by the piano, unsure of what to do next. His heart was still racing from the unexpected attention, and he wasn't sure how to react to the sudden change in the room's energy. He caught the eye of his new mother, who beamed at him from across the room, pride evident in her expression. For the first time since his arrival, the boy felt something close to acceptance. It wasn't full, not yet, but it was a start. The music had given him a voice, a way to connect with the people who had once seen him as invisible. In the days that followed, the boy's relationship with the grandparents remained complicated, but something had undeniably shifted. The music had opened a door, one that couldn't be closed again. The grandparents, while still reserved, no longer looked at the boy with the same disdain. There was a flicker of respect in their eyes, a grudging acknowledgement of his talent. The boy, though still unsure of his place in the family, began to feel a sense of hope that maybe, just maybe, things could change. The music had been the turning point, and it would continue to be the bridge between them. The confrontation had been building for weeks, the tension thick in the air like a storm waiting to break. The boy, buoyed by the unexpected recognition his music had brought him, could no longer suppress the questions that had haunted him since he first arrived at the mansion. Why did the grandparents despise him so much? Why had they treated him like an outsider from the moment he entered their lives? These questions swirled in his mind, gaining strength with each passing day. He couldn't ignore them any longer. The music had given him courage, and now, it was time to confront the truth. It happened one evening, after another strained family dinner. The boy had played the piano earlier, and once again, the room had fallen silent, his music drawing admiration from everyone present. Everyone, that is, except the grandparents, who sat stone-faced, as if determined not to be moved. Their silence was louder than any applause, and this time, the boy couldn't bear it. As the guests filtered out and the family gathered in the parlor, he stood up, his heart pounding. He looked directly at the grandparents, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Why do you hate me so much?" he asked, the words hanging heavy in the air. The question hit the room like a bolt of lightning. The grandmother froze, her teacup halfway to her lips, while the grandfather's eyes darkened with an emotion the boy couldn't quite read. There was a long pause, a suffocating silence as the weight of the boy's words settled over them all. The boy, his heart in his throat, refused to back down. He had kept quiet for too long, endured their disdain in silence. But now, after everything, he needed answers. "What have I done to make you hate me?" His voice wavered, but the strength behind it was unmistakable. The grandmother opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She glanced at the grandfather, her usual sharpness dulled by the suddenness of the confrontation. It was the grandfather who finally broke the silence, his voice low and heavy with something the boy didn't expect: regret. "It's not you," the old man said, his gaze falling to the floor. "It was never about you." His words hung in the air, confusing the boy even more. He had spent months believing that their hatred was personal, that he was somehow to blame for their coldness. But now, for the first time, the grandfather's voice held something different. The boy's heart raced as he stared at the grandfather, trying to make sense of his words. "Then what is it?" the boy pressed, his voice softer now, but still determined. The grandfather remained silent for a long moment, his hands gripping the arms of his chair tightly. It was clear that he was struggling, fighting against the emotions that had been buried for so long. Finally, he spoke again, his voice thick with emotion. "You remind us of someone," he said quietly, his eyes distant, as though he were seeing someone who wasn't there. "Someone we lost a long time ago." The room seemed to grow colder as the grandfather's words settled over them. The boy stood still, his confusion deepening. "Who?" he asked, though a part of him already sensed the answer. The grandfather closed his eyes, his face contorted with pain. "Our son," he said, the words barely above a whisper. "He was a musician like you." The boy's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't known the family had lost a son. No one had ever mentioned it, and now, the truth was unraveling before him, revealing a pain that went far deeper than he had imagined. The grandmother, who had remained silent, finally spoke, her voice trembling. "He was everything to us," she said, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "And when we lost him, we lost ourselves." Her voice cracked, and she looked away, unable to meet the boy's gaze. "When you came into our lives, all we could see was him. Your music. It brought it all back. The pain, the memories, everything." The boy's heart ached as he listened to her. For months, he had believed their hatred was directed at him. But now he saw the truth. They had been haunted by their own grief, unable to separate him from the loss of their son. The revelation left the boy reeling. He had never imagined that their rejection had been born from such deep pain. The grandparents had been protecting themselves, building walls around their hearts to keep the past at bay. But now, as the truth hung in the air, those walls began to crumble. The boy, his voice barely above a whisper, asked, "Why didn't you tell me?" The grandfather sighed heavily. "Because we didn't want to face it ourselves," he admitted. "We didn't want to remember." His words were filled with the weight of years of unresolved grief, and for the first time, the boy saw them not as villains, but as broken people. The boy felt a flood of emotions, anger, sadness, compassion, all swirling within him. He had been an unwitting participant in their struggle, a reminder of a wound they had never healed. But now that the truth was out, he realized that their pain was as deep as his own. The boy, who had spent so long feeling like an outsider, suddenly understood that the rejection had never truly been about him. It had been about the loss of their son, and the music that brought all those memories rushing back. The boy looked at them, his heart heavy, but also softened by the understanding that came with the truth. In that moment, something shifted. The grandparents, though still grappling with their emotions, seemed different, softer, more vulnerable. They had spent so long hiding their grief, pushing it down, and now it was finally out in the open. The boy, though still hurt, felt a strange sense of relief. He had his answers, and while they didn't erase the pain of the past few months, they gave him a new perspective. The confrontation had broken something open, something that couldn't be easily put back together. But it was also the first step toward healing, for all of them. After the emotional confrontation, the atmosphere in the mansion shifted. It was subtle at first, little gestures, softer glances, a slight loosening of the tension that had gripped the household for so long. The grandparents, though still guarded, began to look at the boy differently. The truth of their past, once buried and ignored, had been spoken aloud, and it seemed to open a path towards something the boy had long craved: acceptance. It wasn't immediate, nor was it easy, but for the first time, there was a glimmer of hope that the walls between them might come down. The grandmother, who had always been the sharpest in her judgments, was the first to change. She would watch the boy more often now, not with the cold, dismissive gaze of before, but with something more thoughtful, almost hesitant. The boy, for his part, noticed the shift but didn't quite know how to respond. He had spent so long being wary of her that this new version of the grandmother left him unsure of where he stood. But one day, as they crossed paths in the hallway, she paused, her voice soft and tentative as she spoke. "You play beautifully," she said, her words a quiet olive branch. The boy nodded, unsure what to say. But in that small exchange, something significant had shifted. The grandfather's change came more slowly. He was a man of few words, still holding onto his pride and the armor of years spent hiding his grief. But the boy's music, which had once been a source of pain, now became a way for the old man to reconnect with parts of himself he had long buried. He began to linger more often in the rooms where the boy played, no longer hiding in the shadows but sitting quietly nearby, as if the music were drawing him in. He didn't speak much, but the boy could feel the shift. The rejection that had once felt so heavy now seemed to be giving way to something else, something softer, something like respect. The boy, though still cautious, began to feel a tentative sense of belonging. The rejection that had once defined his time in the mansion was slowly being replaced by gestures of goodwill. The grandmother's occasional compliments, the grandfather's silent presence during his piano sessions. These were small things, but they meant the world to the boy. For the first time since he had arrived, he felt as though he wasn't just an outsider looking in. He was becoming part of the family, slowly but surely. The process was far from complete, but it was a start, and that was enough for now. The boy's new mother, who had watched the transformation with quiet hope, was overjoyed. She had always believed in the boy, had always seen his potential and his worth, but to see her parents finally begin to open their hearts to him filled her with a deep sense of relief. She knew the road to full acceptance would be long, but for the first time, she felt that it was possible. She continued to support the boy, encouraging his music and making sure he knew how much he was loved. Her love had been the constant light in his life, and now, with the grandparents slowly coming around, the boy's world was beginning to brighten even more. Forgiveness, though, was a complex thing. It wasn't as simple as the grandparents suddenly deciding to love the boy. There were still moments of awkwardness, moments where old habits of distance and coldness crept back in, but each time, the boy felt that the gap between them was shrinking. The music remained at the center of it all, a bridge that connected their hearts even when words failed. The boy continued to play, pouring his emotions into the piano, and the grandparents continued to listen. Each note was a step toward healing, each melody a chance to rebuild the fractured relationships that had once seemed beyond repair. There were moments of breakthrough, moments that made the boy believe that true acceptance was within reach. One afternoon, after he had finished playing a particularly moving piece, the grandfather approached him. His steps were slow, deliberate, and when he spoke, his voice was rough, as though he were used to offering praise. "You remind me of him," the old man said quietly, his eyes distant with memory. The boy understood who he meant, the son they had lost. For the first time, the grandfather's words didn't feel like a burden. Instead, they felt like a connection. The boy nodded, grateful for the words, even though they carried the weight of the past. The grandmother, too, began to open up in small ways. She started inviting the boy to join her for tea, something she had never done before. The conversations were awkward at first, stilted by years of distance and misunderstanding, but slowly, they began to talk more freely. She asked him about his life before the mansion, about the things he liked and didn't like. And though these talks were brief, they were filled with something that had been missing before: genuine interest. The boy, though still wary, felt the warmth in these moments, a warmth he had longed for since the day he arrived. The process of forgiveness and acceptance was slow, but it was real. The boy could feel the change in the air, could sense the way the grandparents' hearts were gradually softening toward him. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, moments where the old resentments flared up, but the overall direction was one of healing. The boy, who had once believed he would never truly belong, now saw that there was hope. The mansion, which had once felt cold and unwelcoming, was slowly becoming a place where he could build a future. The family, broken though it had been, was starting to come together again. In the end, it was the music that had brought them to this point. The boy's talent, his passion, had opened doors that had been locked for years. It had allowed the grandparents to see him not as a reminder of their loss, but as a new chapter in their lives. The boy, for his part, had found more than just acceptance. He had found a way to heal the wounds of the past. As the days passed, the family continued to grow closer, and the boy began to feel something he had never thought possible. He was home. In the weeks that followed, the mansion was filled with a new kind of harmony. The boy's music had not only softened the hearts of the grandparents, but it brought a sense of peace to the entire household. What had once been a place of tension and unspoken grief was now a home where healing seemed possible. The music, which had started as the boy's private refuge, had become the thread that connected them all. It wasn't just about the notes he played. It was about the emotions behind them, the unspoken stories that the melodies carried. Through the piano, the family found a way to move forward. The boy had discovered something profound about himself through the piano, something more than just a talent for music. It had become a form of expression, a way for him to connect with the world and with the family that had once kept him at arm's length. Each time he played, he felt a sense of purpose, as if the music were not just for him, but for everyone around him. The boy's journey from orphan to accepted family member had been long and painful, but the music had been his constant companion, guiding him through every moment of doubt, rejection, and hope. For the grandparents, the music became a reminder of what they had lost, but also of what they had gained. They had spent years grieving in silence, locking away the memories of their son, trying to protect themselves from the pain of his absence. But the boy's music had unlocked those doors, forcing them to confront the past they had tried so hard to forget. And in doing so, they found a way to heal. The boy, with his quiet determination and his gift for music, had given them something they didn't know they needed: a chance at redemption, a way to mend the broken pieces of their family. The boy's new mother watched with quiet pride as the relationships between her parents and her son slowly transformed. She had always believed in him, had seen the potential in him from the moment she adopted him, but even she hadn't expected the profound impact he would have on the family. The music, she realized, had been the key to everything. It had given the boy a voice when words weren't enough, and it had allowed her parents to see him not as a replacement for their lost son, but as someone unique, someone who had his own place in their lives. The healing had begun, and it was all thanks to the music. The boy, though still quiet and introspective, felt a deep sense of belonging that he had never known before. The mansion, once cold and imposing, had become a place where he could grow, where he could be himself without fear of judgment. He no longer played the piano in secret. Now, his music filled the halls openly, bringing a sense of warmth and connection to the family. The grandparents, once distant and cold, now sat with him during his performances, listening not just with their ears, but with their hearts. Each note was a reminder of how far they had all come, and how much they had learned about forgiveness, acceptance, and love. The music also gave the boy a sense of identity, something he had never had before. In the orphanages, he had been just another face, another child with no past and no future. But here, in this family, he had found his place. The piano had given him more than just a talent. It had given him a future, a way to define himself beyond his past. The boy knew now that he wasn't just an orphan anymore. He was a musician, an artist, and a beloved member of a family that had once seemed so far out of reach. The music had bridged the gap between them, and in doing so, it had transformed them all. The grandparents, too, had changed. They had learned to see the boy for who he was, not as a reminder of their loss, but as a new beginning. The grandfather, who had once refused to acknowledge the boy's presence, now spoke to him openly, offering words of encouragement and, at times, sharing stories of the son they had lost. The grandmother, who had been so sharp and critical, now watched the boy with something like admiration in her eyes. They had found a way to honor their son's memory without letting it overshadow the new life that had entered their home. In the boy's music, they found a way to remember and to move forward at the same time. The boy's journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. The rejection he had once felt so deeply was now a distant memory, replaced by a sense of connection and belonging that filled him with quiet joy. The music had been the key to everything. It had opened doors that words couldn't, and it had brought the family together in a way that nothing else could have. The boy played every day now, not just for himself, but for the family that had become his own. Each note was a celebration of the life he had built, the love he had found, and the future that lay ahead. As the months passed, the boy's music became a central part of the family's life. It wasn't just a talent. It was the thread that held them together, a constant reminder of how far they had come. The boy, once an outsider, now stood at the heart of the family, his music filling the mansion with a sense of hope and renewal. The grandparents, who had once viewed him as a burden, now saw him as a gift, someone who had not only healed their family but had given them a chance to start again. The music had redeemed them all, and in doing so, it had given them a second chance at happiness. In the end, the music was more than just sound. It was a story, a journey, a way of connecting hearts that had been broken for too long. The boy's journey from orphan to family member had been marked by pain, rejection, and loss, but through the power of music, he had found his place in the world. The mansion, once a symbol of his isolation, was now a home filled with love and acceptance. The boy had found his family, and in doing so, he had found himself. And as the music filled the air, the story of their redemption played on, note by note, a melody of hope that would echo for years to come. If this story touched your heart, Wait until you see what's next. The journey is far from over, and the next video is already waiting for you, packed with more unforgettable moments and emotional twists. Curious about what happens next? Hit play and let the adventure continue. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications so you won't miss any of the incredible stories we have lined up for you. Your next favorite tale is just one click away. Don't forget to leave a comment below. What did you think of this story? We'd love to hear from you.